My Apache neighbor caught me
Shouldn't
on
have
a
come
blind
back.
date. Then she
told you there was
asked,
nothing left
"Why
for
didn't
you."
you ask me instead?" His morning started before the sun rose, when the air was cool and the world was still. He liked that time, the way everything felt untouched and calm. A cup of coffee in hand, he would step outside onto his porch, watching the first birds arrive to greet the day. The soft rustle of leaves and the occasional crow in the distance were the sounds he liked best. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful sometimes. Life had a way of moving around him while he stayed steady, and he had grown accustomed to it. Next door lived an Apache woman. He had known her for years, though they weren't close. Their relationship was polite, casual, and easy, nothing complicated. She waved when he watered his small garden in the mornings, and he nodded when she walked her dog down the dirt road. Occasionally, their conversations stretched a little longer, a comment about the weather or a shared joke about the town's slow pace. But for the most part, they were neighbors in the simplest sense, aware of each other, yet separated by their own lives. He often thought about her, more than he expected, not in any dramatic or romantic way at first, but more like an awareness that she existed as a constant in his life. She was independent, strong, and quietly confident. She carried herself in a way that drew attention without trying, and over the years he had come to respect her deeply. He admired her resilience, the way she handled challenges without complaint. Yet, despite this respect and quiet admiration, he had never acted on it. Fear, shyness, and a long habit of keeping to himself had kept him from ever asking her to share more than a casual conversation. That evening began like any other day. He had spent the afternoon finishing up chores around his property, fixing a fence post, and tending to a small vegetable patch he had started last spring. By evening, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. He showered quickly, feeling the fatigue in his shoulders and back, and changed into something slightly more formal. He was going on a blind date. The idea had been planted by a coworker who cared about his social life, or the lack of it. "You're too quiet," she had said, shaking her head. "You need to get out there before it's too late." Reluctantly, he had agreed. The blind date felt like an adventure and a challenge all at once. He didn't expect much. He was going with the mindset of seeing what the evening brought, no more, no less. He arrived at the restaurant, a modest place not far from town, its warm lights spilling onto the street. He felt nervous as he walked inside. It had been years since he had put himself in this kind of situation. The smell of cooked food, the quiet hum of conversation, and the soft clinking of cutlery filled the room. He looked around, searching for the person he was supposed to meet. A woman waved him over from a table near the back. She smiled, and he returned it politely, sitting down with a polite nod. For the first few minutes, he tried to engage in conversation. They talked about simple things, work, hobbies, and small stories about the town. He found himself distracted, however, his mind drifting to the familiar thought of his neighbor. What would she think if she knew he was here, sitting across from a stranger? He felt a sudden pang of guilt, as though he had done something wrong simply by agreeing to the date. Then, as if the universe had decided to intervene, she walked in. His neighbor. She didn't immediately see him, her attention drawn elsewhere. But the moment their eyes met across the restaurant, a sudden stillness seemed to settle over him. Time felt strange, almost slower, as though the noise of the restaurant faded into the background. She froze, and he froze in response. Their brief glance carried years of unspoken words, years of hesitation and quiet longing. He could see the surprise in her eyes, the slight confusion that quickly shifted into curiosity. His heart pounded faster than it had in years. He tried to focus on his date, on the polite conversation they were having, but it was impossible. The presence of someone he knew so well and yet had never approached in this way made everything else seem trivial. The stranger across from him noticed the change in his demeanor, the subtle distraction, but before she could ask, He quickly smiled and tried to continue the conversation. The neighbor lingered near the doorway, almost hesitant, almost unsure if she should approach. His mind raced with possibilities, questions, and fears. Did she think he had intentionally arranged this? Did she assume he wasn't interested in her at all? 1,000 thoughts crossed his mind at once. It was strange, almost surreal, seeing someone so familiar in a completely unexpected context. Meanwhile, his blind date seemed nice enough, but he realized that she couldn't possibly fill the space that had quietly existed next door for so many years. He felt an unexpected sense of relief and frustration all at once. Relief, because he had been dragged out of his comfort zone. Frustration, because it reminded him of the choices he hadn't made, the chances he hadn't taken. He excused himself for a moment, saying he needed some air. The cool evening outside felt refreshing against his warm skin. The streetlights illuminated the quiet road, and in the distance, he could see her standing there, watching him. She hadn't moved yet, as if she were waiting, and the sight of her made his chest tighten with unspoken emotion. The world felt smaller in that moment, and yet heavier. Every unasked question, every missed opportunity seemed to gather around him, pressing him to finally acknowledge what had been there all along. He knew that whatever happened next could change everything. The quiet, routine life he had built for himself was suddenly confronted by the possibility of something deeper, something meaningful that had been right next door the entire time. He had spent years assuming the only path forward was the one he had taken: work, solitude, polite interactions. But now, the rules of his quiet existence felt inadequate. The neighbor finally walked toward him, her expression calm but curious. There was no anger or judgment in her eyes, only awareness. The moment felt like a delicate balance between fear and hope. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the conversation that was about to happen, but he instinctively knew that he couldn't step away. This was a turning point, a moment where the quiet life he had always known might intersect with something entirely new and unexpected. As she approached, he took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. Every step she took seemed deliberate, measured, as though even she felt the weight of the moment. He realized that the years of polite distance, of unspoken thoughts, and of missed chances had led to this single evening. And for the first time in a long while, he felt that life had a way of surprising him, showing him that even the quietest routines could be disrupted by something unexpected, beautiful, and life-changing. The air between them held unspoken words, questions that had lingered for years. And in that pause, as they finally stood face to face on the quiet street outside the restaurant, he sensed that this encounter was the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted. Something that had been quietly waiting all along just next door. The man's heart was still racing as he stood there, looking at his neighbor. The quiet street seemed unusually alive, as if it too was waiting for something to happen. She didn't speak at first. Her eyes held a mixture of surprise, curiosity, and something else he couldn't quite name. It was the look of someone who had seen a side of life they hadn't expected, and now had to face it quietly, without words. He cleared his throat, trying to find something to say, but no words came. The years of routine and caution had left him unpracticed at these moments. He had spent so long keeping his emotions in check, convinced that speaking them aloud would only make things awkward or uncomfortable. But now, faced with her calm yet expectant gaze, he realized that silence wasn't enough anymore. Something had to be said, or everything would remain unspoken forever. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was calm, soft, but carried an unusual strength. "Why didn't you ask me instead?" she asked. The question hit him like a sudden wind. Simple words but loaded with meaning. It wasn't angry or accusing. It wasn't even disappointed. It was a question that demanded honesty. And at the same time, it opened a door he hadn't even known was there. He blinked, taken aback. He hadn't expected that. He had assumed, for years, that she would never be interested in him, that she was content with their polite neighborly exchanges, that she had her life and he had his. And yet here she was, standing in front of him, asking a question that turned all his assumptions upside down. He realized in that instant that fear had stopped him for far too long. I didn't know if you were interested," he said finally, his voice low but sincere. "I didn't want to overstep. I didn't want to make things awkward between us." His words felt clumsy, but they were honest, and she listened, her expression thoughtful, neither dismissing him nor judging him. She nodded slowly. "I never thought you would be." "I guess we've both been afraid," she said. Her tone was soft, almost wistful, but there was no bitterness. It was the kind of honesty that only comes from years of quiet observation, of knowing someone well enough to understand them without needing them to explain. The man felt a strange mixture of relief and fear. Relief because he had finally admitted what he had felt for years. Fear because he realized the moment demanded a decision, and decisions were never easy. They stood there for a few moments in silence, letting the words hang between them. It was a delicate balance. Neither wanted to rush, and yet neither could ignore what had suddenly surfaced. The man could feel his heart beating faster, his thoughts scattering in every direction at once. He realized that the evening had started as a blind date, a casual adventure arranged by someone else. But now, the world felt different. This wasn't about chance or coincidence anymore. It was about something real, something that had been waiting quietly for years. "I think I should have asked you a long time ago," he admitted, finally finding the courage to speak fully. "I didn't because I was afraid of losing what we already had. I didn't want to risk it, but now I see that maybe I was wrong. Maybe I should have taken the chance." His words trembled slightly, but they were full of truth. She smiled, a small, almost shy smile that made him feel like the years of distance had melted away in an instant. "I think I might have felt the same way," she said. Her honesty struck him deeper than he had expected. For all the polite conversations, the nods and waves over the years, she had also carried unspoken feelings, quietly, patiently, until this very moment. The man felt a rush of emotions, relief, hope, and a kind of fear that was entirely new. It wasn't the fear of danger or failure. It was the fear of the unknown, the fear of stepping into a life that could be different from the quiet routine he had built. He realized that everything he had assumed about himself and about her had been based on caution, not reality. For a moment they simply stood there, looking at each other, as the evening sky grew darker around them. The gentle streetlights cast soft glows, making the moment feel almost sacred. The man realized that the world had somehow become smaller, tighter, more intimate. In that quiet space, surrounded by nothing but the night and their own thoughts, a connection formed that was stronger than years of distance could have prevented. He finally took a deep breath. "Would you like to take a walk?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it carried a weight of intention. She nodded, and together they walked down the quiet road, their steps falling into a rhythm that felt natural, as if they had always been walking side by side, even if they hadn't realized it. As they walked, they began to talk. At first, the conversation was careful, cautious. They shared small details about their day, about things they had noticed around the town, about memories from years ago that neither had thought to mention. But slowly the conversation deepened. They talked about their lives, their fears, their dreams, and the things they had carried alone for too long. The man spoke about the quietness he had surrounded himself with, the fear of failure, the hesitation that had kept him from asking her out all those years. She shared her own experiences, the responsibilities she had carried, and the moments she had felt overlooked or underestimated. It was remarkable how naturally the conversation flowed, despite the years of distance. They laughed, sometimes softly, sometimes a little louder than intended, breaking the tension that had built up over decades. They discovered shared values, similar experiences, and a mutual understanding that words had failed to convey in their previous years as neighbors. Every step they took felt like peeling away layers, revealing the truth of who they were and how much they had silently respected and cared for each other all along. At one point, they stopped near a small park, the kind with benches and old trees. The man leaned against a tree, feeling the cool bark against his back, and she sat on a bench nearby. He realized that he was no longer nervous in the same way he had been earlier. The fear of awkwardness had been replaced by anticipation and curiosity. He wanted to understand her, to know her more deeply, to see the world through her eyes. And she seemed to feel the same, watching him with a calm, quiet intensity that made his chest feel full. The conversation shifted toward their past attempts at connection. He admitted he had often wondered what it would have been like if he had asked her out years ago. She laughed softly, admitting that she had thought about the same thing. They both realized that fear and hesitation had kept them from seeing what had been there all along. And yet there was no regret. Instead, there was a quiet relief that they had finally arrived at this moment, even if it had taken years longer than necessary. As the evening grew darker, they started to walk again, this time more slowly, savoring the calm of the night. The stars were beginning to appear, small pinpricks of light against the dark sky, and for a moment, everything felt suspended. The man felt that this was one of those rare moments in life when the ordinary transforms into something extraordinary. He had come expecting a casual blind date, a fleeting adventure arranged by someone else, and instead had found a moment of honesty, connection, and potential that could change everything. By the time they returned to their respective homes, there was a quiet understanding between them. Nothing had been forced, nothing had been declared in dramatic terms, but both knew that something important had begun. The man watched as she disappeared into her house, and he felt a mixture of excitement and calm. He realized that life had a way of showing its most meaningful moments when least expected, and that sometimes the right person had been standing next door all along. As he closed the door to his own home, he reflected on the evening. The blind date, the surprise appearance of his neighbor, the question she had asked, it all felt like a turning point. He understood now that waiting in silence, letting years pass by, had almost cost him a chance at happiness. But the evening had reminded him that courage, honesty, and openness could create new possibilities, even after years of quiet. He sat down with a cup of tea, looking out the window at the faint glow of streetlights, and felt a sense of peace. The evening had not been perfect, nor had it been simple, but it had been real. And in its reality lay a new path, one that he could explore without fear, one that promised connection, understanding, and perhaps even something more. The night had been unexpected, full of emotion and quietly transformative, and he knew that tomorrow would bring a new beginning, one that might finally allow him to step closer to the neighbor he had always admired, respected, and in ways he was only beginning to understand. Cared for deeply. After that evening, their lives quietly shifted. The man found himself thinking about the neighbor more often than he expected. It wasn't obsession or longing, it was something gentler, a new awareness. He noticed small details about her, how she tucked her hair behind her ear when she laughed, how her eyes seemed to catch the sunlight in ways he hadn't noticed before, and how her presence made the familiar streets feel different. It was as if a new layer of life had appeared quietly, and he was only just beginning to see it. She, too, seemed to notice the change. The next morning, when he stepped outside to tend his small garden, she waved from her porch, and for the first time there was a smile that lingered. It wasn't the polite nod of neighbors, it was a look that held warmth, curiosity, and something more. They didn't speak much at first. Words weren't necessary, the shift in their connection was clear. The silence between them was comfortable, even comforting, something he had never experienced with anyone before. Over the next few days, their interactions grew slowly. A brief conversation while fetching the mail, a shared joke about the slow pace of the town, a comment about the weather. They were small things, almost insignificant to an outsider, but they carried meaning for both of them. Each interaction was a reminder that the evening of the blind date and her question hadn't been a fluke. It had opened a door, and they were beginning to step through it together. One afternoon, the man found himself walking past her house and paused. She was outside, arranging flowers in a small pot near her porch. The sunlight caught her hair and he felt a familiar flutter in his chest. He waved, and she smiled, gesturing for him to come over. His nerves flared briefly. What could they possibly talk about now that they had acknowledged their feelings? But he reminded himself that honesty was the best path forward. They sat together on her porch, sipping cold drinks. The conversation started cautiously, with light topics like the weather, the new plants in her garden, and recent news in town. But as the minutes passed, the words grew deeper, more personal. He spoke about the quiet years he had spent alone, the loss of opportunities, and the walls he had built to protect himself. He admitted that he had always admired her from a distance, but fear and uncertainty had stopped him from saying anything. She listened with calm attention, nodding occasionally, her eyes never leaving his face. Then she began to share her own story. She spoke about her life as an Apache woman, the responsibilities she had carried, and the subtle pressures of living in a small community. She had faced moments of misunderstanding and isolation, and she explained how those experiences shaped her, how they taught her patience and resilience. Listening to her, he realized how much strength she possessed, and how much he had overlooked in their years as neighbors. The more they talked, the more they discovered similarities in their lives. Both had experienced disappointment and isolation. Both had built quiet, careful routines as a way to cope. Both had quietly admired and respected the other, never daring to bridge the distance until now. It was a rare moment, a kind of recognition that comes only when two people have lived parallel lives and suddenly see each other clearly. As the conversation continued, they laughed more freely than before. Memories of awkward encounters, small mishaps, and long-forgotten town events were shared, and the tension that had once held them apart seemed to melt. For the first time, they could talk without fear of judgment or misunderstanding. The neighbor, who had always seemed so self-contained, revealed a gentle humor that made him smile. And he, usually reserved, found himself opening up in ways he hadn't with anyone for years. One evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, they walked together down the quiet street. The air was cool and calm, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. Neither spoke for a while. The silence was comfortable. Then she asked him a question he hadn't expected. "Do you ever wonder what it would have been like if we had spoken sooner?" He paused, thinking carefully before answering. "Every day," he admitted. "But I also think that maybe we weren't ready before. Maybe we had to wait until now to truly understand each other." His words surprised even him. There was no hesitation, no fear, only honesty, a simple acknowledgement of time, missed chances, and the possibilities that lay ahead. She smiled softly, and for a moment he felt that their connection had shifted again. It was no longer simply the curiosity and tension of that first encounter. It was recognition and understanding. They were learning each other's rhythms, their ways of thinking and feeling, and they found comfort in the shared understanding. It was a rare kind of connection, quiet yet profound, and it reminded him that meaningful relationships often develop slowly, through observation, patience, and honesty. As the days turned into weeks, they spent more time together, carefully exploring this new dynamic. They cooked meals together occasionally, shared small walks in the evenings, and sometimes just sat quietly, enjoying each other's presence. Each moment revealed more about the other, not through grand gestures but through subtle actions and small details. He noticed how she always checked if he had eaten enough, how she remembered stories he had told weeks ago, and how her laughter seemed to bring warmth into ordinary moments. She noticed how he paid attention to little things, how he respected her space and opinions, and how he quietly offered support without demanding anything in return. During one particularly calm afternoon, they sat by a small creek near the edge of town. The water gurgled softly over stones, and the wind whispered through the trees. They spoke about their past experiences with relationships, both good and bad. He admitted his fear of rejection, how it had kept him from pursuing meaningful connections. She shared her own hesitations, explaining that she had often been careful about whom she trusted, not out of pride but out of self-preservation. It was a moment of vulnerability for both of them, and it strengthened the trust between them. Over time, they began to share hopes for the future. It wasn't about rushing into a formal relationship or changing their lives overnight. It was about learning to rely on each other, to communicate honestly, and to allow a connection to grow naturally. The man realized that he had been waiting for something like this, even if he hadn't known it. The neighbor realized the same. They had both been cautious, careful, and patient, and now they were finally learning what it meant to allow someone in. One day, the man noticed how much he had changed in the weeks since that evening. He was more attentive, more aware of emotions, and more willing to express his thoughts. He found joy in small moments, like the sound of her laughter or the way she paused to watch the sunset. He realized that he had been living in a self-imposed quiet for too long, missing out on meaningful connections. She, too, seemed lighter, more open, and more willing to accept warmth and kindness from someone who had been quietly present all along. As autumn approached, the bond between them continued to deepen. They enjoyed the simple pleasures of the season together, walking through fallen leaves, sipping hot cider, and sharing stories by the fireplace. Their lives were no longer just parallel. They were intertwined in ways that felt natural, comfortable, and real. The man felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the neighbor herself, but for the patience, courage, and honesty that had allowed them to arrive at this point. It was not always easy. Occasionally, old fears crept in, and small misunderstandings arose. But they handled these moments with calm, open communication, learning more about each other's perspectives. The man realized that real connection required effort, patience, and a willingness to see the world through another's eyes. She realized the same, and together, they were discovering a way to share their lives without losing themselves. By the time the first snow arrived, their friendship had quietly transformed into something deeper. It was not yet defined by labels, but by understanding, care, and shared experiences. They had discovered that true connection often grows slowly, nurtured by patience, respect, and honesty. The man realized that the blind date had been a catalyst, but the real change came from the daily moments of attention, laughter, conversation, and quiet reflection. She realized that too, and for the first time in a long time, she felt seen, respected, and valued. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the snow fall gently, he reflected on how far they had come. What had started as a surprising encounter on a quiet street had grown into a meaningful connection. There were no grand promises, no dramatic confessions, just understanding, trust, and a slowly blossoming bond. He realized that the neighbor had been waiting patiently, and so had he, for the right time to recognize the possibilities that had always been there. The man felt a quiet sense of hope, something he hadn't felt in years. He understood that relationships weren't about rushing or grand gestures. They were about showing up, being honest, and learning to trust someone over time. And in the woman next door, he had found someone who understood that truth as well. The snow continued to fall, covering the town in a soft white blanket, and for the first time in a long time, he felt that life could be quietly, beautifully extraordinary. The days that followed their quiet autumn moments were filled with both comfort and uncertainty. While the man and his neighbor had grown closer, life had a way of reminding them that the world beyond their connection still existed. Friends and acquaintances in the small town noticed their increasing closeness and began asking questions. Some offered kind encouragement, while others expressed surprise, even skepticism. That attention, though often well-meaning, brought a subtle tension that neither had expected. They realized that while their bond was growing, they also had to navigate external opinions, which sometimes felt overwhelming. One afternoon, they were walking down the familiar dirt road near the edge of town, the air crisp with the hint of winter approaching. The man felt a quiet excitement as he walked beside her, yet he couldn't ignore the knot of nervousness in his stomach. Even after weeks of growing trust, he was acutely aware of the fragility of new relationships. He understood that while their connection felt strong, it was still delicate, like a fine thread being woven between two hearts. He feared saying the wrong thing, of revealing too much too soon, or of losing the balance they had achieved. She, too, had moments of doubt. The neighbor had lived much of her life cautiously, protecting herself from disappointment and hurt. Though she trusted him more than anyone else in years, a part of her hesitated. She questioned whether stepping further into this connection could disrupt the stability she had built for herself. She feared that revealing too much of her heart could invite pain, just as it had in the past. And yet, despite the doubts, she felt a quiet pull toward him, a sense that this bond, slowly, carefully cultivated, was something rare and worth nurturing. One evening, an unspoken tension emerged. A minor misunderstanding occurred, something small, almost insignificant, but enough to remind them both of the sensitivity of new beginnings. Perhaps it was a casual remark misinterpreted, or a gesture that didn't carry the meaning intended. For a brief moment, distance returned between them. The man felt frustration and regret. He wished he could rewind the moment and clarify his intentions, but life rarely allowed such luxuries. She, on her side, felt the sting of old fears, a reminder that even the strongest connections could be tested. They took a few days of space, allowing the misunderstanding to settle. This pause was uncomfortable but necessary. Both reflected on what mattered most to them. The man thought about the quiet life he had led before meeting her, the routines, the solitude, and the endless what-ifs. He realized that his hesitation, his fear of change, had kept him from experiencing real joy for far too long. He understood now that avoiding risk had cost him meaningful connections, perhaps the most important ones of all. Meanwhile, the neighbor reflected on her own hesitations. She considered the years of caution she had practiced, the self-imposed boundaries that had protected her but also limited her. She thought about the trust she had quietly built with him, about the moments of laughter, honesty, and shared experiences that had gradually shaped a bond she could not ignore. She understood that love, friendship, or companionship, whatever they called it, required courage, and courage required action. After the days of silence, the man decided it was time to act. He walked over to her house in the late afternoon, the air crisp and tinged with the scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. He felt a mix of nerves and determination. Each step toward her porch felt heavier and lighter at the same time, heavier because of the uncertainty, lighter because he was finally moving forward. He rang the doorbell and she opened it, her expression calm but expectant. He looked at her, searching for the right words, and finally said, "I've been thinking. I don't want to let fear hold me back anymore. I value what we have, and I don't want to risk losing it over something small. I care about you more than I realized, and I hope you feel the same." Her eyes softened and a small smile appeared. "I do," she said simply. "I've been afraid, yes, but I think we've both been brave enough to see what this could mean. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be real, and I want it to be real." The simplicity of her words struck him, It was not a dramatic confession or a rushed declaration. It was honesty, steady and calm, and it carried more weight than any grand gesture ever could. They both understood that real connection was built on trust, patience, and courage, not on fleeting passion or external expectations. In the weeks that followed, they began to spend more intentional time together. They took small walks in the quiet fields surrounding their town, sharing thoughts, memories, and dreams. They cooked simple meals together, discovering that even mundane tasks could become moments of connection when shared with someone who truly understood you. They celebrated small victories and supported each other through minor setbacks. Through these shared experiences, their bond deepened, not through dramatic events, but through consistent, gentle acts of care and attention. One evening, as the first snowflakes began to fall, they found themselves sitting together on her porch. The world around them was quiet, the soft white snow covering the familiar landscape. The man reflected on how much he had grown in the past few weeks. He was more open, more willing to share his thoughts and feelings, and more attentive to the subtle ways in which she expressed herself. He realized that this connection had taught him the value of patience, honesty, and presence, lessons that life had long withheld from him. She, too, recognized her growth. She had learned to allow herself to trust, to hope, and to accept the warmth and kindness of another person. The connection had helped her see that vulnerability was not weakness, but a pathway to meaningful companionship. She felt a quiet sense of gratitude for the patience, courage, and honesty they had both invested in this bond. Of course, life still had its small challenges. Friends and neighbors continued to notice their closeness, and occasionally assumptions or questions arose. But they had learned to navigate these moments together, relying on clear communication and mutual understanding. The man realized that external opinions mattered little compared to the trust and connection they were building. She realized the same. Together, they were learning to face the world as a team, quietly but firmly, without fear of judgment. Their growing bond was not marked by grand declarations, but by a steady, reassuring presence in each other's lives. The man began to notice how much joy simple moments brought him. The sound of her laughter, the shared silence during a snowfall, or the way she remembered small details from conversations weeks earlier. He realized that these moments were more meaningful than any extravagant gesture could ever be. One evening, as they walked along a familiar trail lined with autumn leaves, he reflected on the journey they had taken together. From a chance encounter during a blind date to days filled with shared stories, laughter, and quiet reflection, they had arrived at a place of understanding and connection. It had not been simple or predictable, but it had been real, honest, and transformative. He understood now that the risks he had avoided for years were the very ones that led to the most meaningful experiences. She reflected on the same path. She thought about the courage it took to ask and to answer difficult questions, the patience required to build trust, and the joy found in small, everyday moments. She realized that life's most significant relationships were not always dramatic or instant, but often quiet, gradual, and persistent. And she was grateful that they had both been willing to take those small steps, day after day, to reach this point. As the first deep snow settled over the town, they found comfort in their shared space. The man felt a quiet sense of fulfillment, knowing that he had taken the necessary risks to allow this connection to grow. The neighbor felt the same, knowing that her openness had been met with honesty and respect. They understood that this was not the end of their journey, but a meaningful beginning, a foundation built on trust, courage, and shared understanding. The evening closed with them sitting together by the window, watching the snow fall. Neither spoke for a while. The silence was full of contentment, not emptiness. The man felt a quiet warmth in his chest, a sense that he had finally found someone who saw him fully, without pretense or assumption. She felt the same, recognizing a partnership that was steady, genuine and rare. In that quiet, snow-covered world, they had discovered a connection that had the potential to endure, to grow, and to transform the ordinary rhythms of their lives into something extraordinary. It was a season of realization, reflection, and quiet courage. They had learned that meaningful relationships required both patience and action, vulnerability and understanding. And as the snow continued to fall gently outside, they understood that together, they were ready to face whatever challenges might come, with honesty, respect, and a bond built on trust. Winter had settled over the small town, covering everything in a soft, white blanket. The roads, the fields, and even the trees were coated in snow, giving the world a calm and quiet feeling. For the man and his neighbor, life felt different now, though the routines remained familiar. What had changed was the depth of their connection, the trust, care, and understanding that had slowly grown between them. Each day was no longer just another repetition of chores and quiet moments. It carried a sense of shared purpose and warmth. They continued to spend time together, learning more about each other with every passing day. They discovered new joys in simple activities, baking bread in the small kitchen of her home, walking through the snowy fields while the wind carried the faint scent of pine, and sitting by the fireplace sharing stories about their childhoods. Each experience, though ordinary on the surface, became extraordinary because they shared it with someone who truly understood them. One afternoon, they took a long walk through the quiet streets of town. The snow crunched under their boots, and their breath formed small clouds in the cold air. The man noticed the way she smiled at small things, the pattern of frost on a window, the sound of children laughing in the distance, the way the sunlight caught the snow on the trees. He realized that he had been missing these small wonders for years, too caught up in routine and caution to notice. Now, with her by his side, even the smallest things felt vivid and full of life. She, too, noticed changes in herself. She had grown more open and willing to embrace the unexpected, to accept warmth and connection without fear. Before, she had been careful, hesitant, guarding her heart and space. But the bond they had developed gave her a sense of safety, a quiet courage that allowed her to step further into life than she had in years. She felt seen, respected, and appreciated, not for what she could do or what she represented, but for who she truly was. The man felt a quiet joy in seeing her this way. He realized that relationships weren't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. They were about consistency, honesty, and being present. It was the simple acts that mattered most. Listening when she needed to speak, offering support without judgment, and celebrating the small victories together. He knew now that love, in its truest form, was a combination of patience, attention, and shared experience, and that it had been waiting for him in the neighbor's quiet presence all along. As the days passed, they began to plan small activities together for the future. They discussed ideas like planting a small winter garden, exploring nearby trails when the snow cleared, and cooking meals together regularly. These plans were not about rushing or forcing a commitment. They were about building a shared life naturally, one step at a time. The man understood that this slow, deliberate approach was part of what made their connection strong and sustainable. She understood it too, appreciating that their bond was based on mutual respect and understanding, not on external expectations or societal pressures. One evening, after a day spent shoveling snow and clearing paths, they sat together by her porch. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the white landscape. They were quiet at first, simply enjoying the calm and the warmth of the fire inside. The man looked at her, feeling a mixture of admiration, gratitude, and hope. He thought about how far they had come, from a surprising encounter on a blind date to this quiet, steady companionship that had grown stronger each day. "I never expected life to lead me here," he said softly, breaking the silence. She turned to him, curiosity and warmth in her eyes. "I know what you mean," she replied. It's funny how something so unexpected can become the most important thing in your life." He nodded, feeling the truth in her words. It wasn't dramatic or exaggerated. It was real, simple, and profoundly meaningful. They talked about their journey, about the moments of hesitation, misunderstanding, and fear that had almost kept them apart. They laughed at the awkwardness of that first evening, remembering how surprised and unsure they had both been. They reflected on the growth they had achieved individually and together, the courage to speak honestly, the patience to listen, and the trust to accept vulnerability. Each realization strengthened their bond, making them feel more connected than ever. The man realized that he had spent much of his life avoiding risk, missing chances to experience true connection. Now, with her by his side, he understood the importance of taking chances, of stepping forward even when uncertain. She realized the same, that opening her heart and allowing someone in didn't weaken her, but enriched her life in ways she hadn't imagined. Together, they were learning that love and companionship were not about perfection or timing. They were about honesty, respect, and the willingness to grow together. One night, after a day spent walking in the falling snow, they returned to her porch and sat quietly, watching the snow accumulate on the rooftops and fields. The man felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He realized that the neighbor's presence had brought him more joy than he could have anticipated, not because of excitement or drama, but because of the simple, steady companionship they had nurtured over weeks and months. She leaned back, looking at the falling snow and feeling the warmth of the fire behind her. She reflected on her life, the years of caution and careful living, and how those years had led her to this very moment. She had learned that meaningful connections often came quietly, without fanfare, and that the most important relationships were built over time, through shared understanding and effort. She felt grateful for the patience and honesty that had allowed them to reach this point. As winter deepened, they continued to enjoy each other's company, finding joy in both ordinary and special moments. They celebrated small victories, like successfully baking bread together or completing a long walk through the snowy fields. They supported each other through minor setbacks, like cold days or tired evenings, and found strength in simply being present for one another. Every day they discovered more about each other, the habits, the quirks, the small things that made life richer. Through it all, they never rushed. There was no pressure to define their relationship with labels or expectations. Instead, they focused on the reality of their connection, the trust, care, and understanding they shared. The man realized that patience was a crucial part of love, and that the bond they were building would be stronger for it. She realized the same, appreciating the deliberate pace and the deep respect that underpinned every interaction. One snowy evening, they walked to a small hill near the edge of town, watching the world around them glisten under the moonlight. The town was quiet, and the snow muffled all sound except for the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. They stood together, shoulders brushing lightly, and looked out over the familiar landscape that now felt transformed. Life, they realized, had taken ordinary moments and made them extraordinary simply because they shared them. The man spoke softly. "I'm glad we finally found our way to each other. It feels right." She nodded, smiling, and replied, "It does. We've been patient, and now it feels like we're exactly where we're supposed to be." Their hands brushed together, tentative at first, then more confidently, a small but significant gesture that symbolized their trust, connection, and willingness to move forward together. As the season continued, they embraced the ordinary as extraordinary. Morning coffees became shared rituals, evening walks became opportunities for reflection, and even simple chores were transformed into moments of companionship. They discovered that the quiet consistency of life, when shared with someone who understood and cared for them, could be as fulfilling as any grand adventure. By the time the first signs of spring appeared, the melting snow, the soft green buds emerging from the trees, they had established a rhythm together. Their bond had grown into a steady, reliable presence in each other's lives. They had discovered the value of patience, the importance of honesty, and the strength found in shared understanding. Life was no longer just routine or solitude. It was shared, meaningful, and rich with connection. The man realized that the blind date that had begun the journey was never truly the catalyst. It was the courage to speak, to trust, and to be present that had made everything possible. She realized the same. Together, they had learned that life's most important relationships often arrive quietly, next door in ordinary moments, and grow stronger through patience, effort, and mutual care. As they sat together one evening, watching the sun set over the snow-melted fields, the man reflected on the journey they had taken. From a surprising encounter to moments of doubt and distance, to the slow, deliberate building of trust and connection, they had arrived at a place of deep understanding and companionship. He felt gratitude, not just for the neighbor herself, but for the patience and courage that had brought them to this point. She reflected on the same journey, recognizing the growth, courage, and trust they had both invested. She felt a quiet joy in knowing that their bond was built on reality, honesty, and mutual respect, not fleeting moments, assumptions, or fear. In each other, they had found something rare and enduring, a connection that transformed ordinary life into something deeply meaningful. The story concluded not with dramatic declarations or rushing gestures, but with a quiet certainty. They had found each other. Their journey had been slow, patient, and deliberate, but it was also filled with laughter, honesty, and shared growth. Life was not perfect, nor did it need to be. What mattered was the steady presence, the understanding, and the courage to step into connection when it mattered most. Together, they had discovered that the greatest moments often come quietly, waiting patiently next door, in ordinary lives, until someone is brave enough to notice. And in that discovery, they had found a beginning that promised hope, companionship, and the quiet, enduring joy of being truly seen.